What is up, guys? Haven't made a video in a while. I think the last time I uploaded was late November or early December, something like that. So anyways, I was talking with some people in a Discord server several days ago about what you look for in a CFM and what are your must-haves and what are your deal breakers. So today I want to make a video talking about what I look for in a CFM when I'm trying to join one, and what my must-haves are and what my deal breakers are. So the first thing I'm always going to look for in the rules is, do they allow custom playbooks? And the reason for that is most of the stock playbooks are poorly built with how they have concept overlap. And what I mean by that is you'll find a concept or a version of play in one formation, but then you won't find it all across any of the other formations that are the playbook, or else it'll only occur a few extra times. While if you got the custom playbook editor, you'll be able to find that concept available in other formations. And teams in real life, they'll have their core concepts, which you'll see repeated across most of their formations, if not all of them, and then some counter plays and constraint plays that come off of that. And that's really how I want to run my offense. Is you have your few core concepts that you can run from multiple different looks and keep your reads the same, and then you'll have your counter plays and constraint plays that come off of that. And the other big issue I have is that some of the playbooks will have one version of play that doesn't work well at all, or they'll have a play that works perfectly in the exact same formation, and it's slight variations of the same concept. For example, you have, say, Y corner or something in one formation, and then you have a slight variation of Y corner with the backside tag differently in the same formation, and because of how it's spaced with the wide receiver splits and the depth of the routes, one version works perfectly while the other one doesn't. Well, I'm not going to want the version that doesn't work in my playbook at all. That's going to get dropped straight out of there. Then in the run game, for example, you'll have a power play or a counter play where guards and tackles don't pull correctly. For example, in Arizona's playbook, there's one pistol formation where you'll have a counterplay where you have your guard and tackle pulling, and the play art shows them pulling across the formation like they're supposed to. Except when you go and actually try and run it, they don't actually pull across the formation. They'll take maybe a couple steps over, then immediately turn upfield. Well, you don't have a kick out block, you don't have a lead block, and the backside's not blocked. You're not getting out of the backfield on that play. Then the final thing that happens when leagues don't allow custom playbooks is everyone devolves into using the same few playbooks on offense and defense. So you'll see the Patriots, the 49ers, and the Raiders are some of the most common ones you'll see. And people will always be running the same formations at that. There'll be gun bunch, split close, and the various I formations and under center single back wing formations that people love to run. Stretch, counter, power, a dive, halfback tosses, and deep play action crossing out of it. And that just kind of evolves into cookie cutter gameplay and seeing the same offense and defense every single week. That gets old real fast. Another thing that I'm always going to be looking for is, does the league have rules about cheesing and using blatant exploits? These are things that you just have to accept you're going to face in regular head-to-head matches and mud. But in a CFM game, I don't really want to face that. I'd rather play more realistic or somewhat realistic football. And by what I mean by that is plays that aren't intentionally breaking the AI through user manipulation. So things like motioning players across the field to cause the person in man coverage to be on the complete opposite side of the field, or having blitz plays where defenders can come in through unblocked while only rushing, say, 2 or 3 guys. Then one thing that always seems to cause CFMs to get ruined is rules that, or rather not having rules about trading. What happens when you don't have rules about trading is you'll usually have 1 or 2 guys who are able to kind of finesse everyone who doesn't know what they're doing and manipulate the system to build their super teams. And meanwhile, you have people who have no clue what they're doing, trading away all their players for pennies on the dollar and trading away their picks for practically nothing. And that leads to having a few teams that are completely stacked, and those users aren't leaving the league. Meanwhile, once a person completely tanks their team and they realize they have no chance, they're going to leave the league. Well, new people joining the league, they aren't going to want to stick around with a team that's completely gutted and has nothing to build around. So that makes it hard to keep a full league and get people to join. So usually what I look for on that front is rules regarding trading, specifically rules about CPU trading. Those trades need to be heavily reviewed, and making sure that if it were a user controlling that team, would they actually agree to that trade or not? And the same with even user versus user trades. You want those trades reviewed. I've seen people trade away, I think multiple first round picks is what it was. I think it was like 2 firsts and a second for a receiver who's in his second year in the he's in the mid 70s at only star dev and low to mid 90s speed, I think like 93, 94. Or you could draft a player with just one of those picks, has roughly equal and has more years left on its contract. And you'll see people like that all the time, just completely gutting a team and one person being able to finesse everyone and take advantage of it and build a super team. The other thing that I always look for is roster rules regarding player movement and player positions. You want people to be able to move players around and get them into position to succeed based off of what they're actually capable of. For example, you don't want super slow cornerbacks that playing down there, playing man coverage underneath, but you can move them to safety. Or moving offensive linemen, defensive linemen around, and moving linebackers to defensive end, because really they're the same position, they're edge rushers. And the same thing with shifting coverage linebackers around. What I don't like seeing is leagues where people move safeties with high speeds to linebacker, or even cornerbacks to linebacker. So you see people moving safeties with mid-90s speeds to linebacker and just trying to use and cover the entire middle of the field. What I'd like to see is leagues that either don't allow that at all or require that the safeties be below a certain speed threshold, and also meet certain things like weight and height requirements. And the same thing on offense, like moving receiver to tight end. Well, I'm not opposed to the complete, I'm not supporting completely banning it, but I'd like to see the receiver meet certain weight and height requirements and speed as well. And some leagues that completely don't have anything, you'll see Tyreek Hill at running back and people running stretch and dive with him every play. Something else I'm always going to be looking for is stat padding rules. Whether the league allows people to play the CPU or user teams on autopilot, or someone's blowing another player out, I usually look for leagues that have some type of cap on how many yards you can throw for, how many touchdowns, how many yards you can rush for, rushing touchdowns, and such. Otherwise, people will tend to take advantage of that and manipulate it to have quarterbacks throw for 1,000 yards a game and 10 plus touchdowns. And that just kind of throws off the whole postseason rewards and XP player of the week and such. And also the record book just kind of becomes meaningless. Rather than having the players who set passing records or rushing records in games that are competitive the entire way through. For example, you look at Texas Tech versus Oklahoma several years ago when Patrick Mahomes was there. That game was a close game. It went down to the wire, and Texas Tech still didn't win when Mahomes threw for 700 something yards. It wasn't they're beating up on some D3 school and still had Mahomes in the fourth quarter throwing deep every play. They needed every yard and every point they could get that game, and they still lost. Now, moving on to some things that are absolute deal breakers for me. Probably number one is rules that paint with a broad brush. And what I mean by that is rules that are meant to take away something specific, but instead are broad and just overgeneralize that take away multiple other things besides that. For example, you have play call cooldowns. People will try and put them in to prevent people from running the same plays over and over on offense, and to increase play variety and limit people from being able to run cheese plays. Well, in the process, you wind up removing the people's ability to run the correct calls on defense and sometimes the correct calls on offense. You always want to see play variety, and it's good to have leagues that aren't having people just spamming the same plays over and over, just to prevent it from getting boring and keep it more realistic. But what happens is the play call cooldowns and play call limits impact both offense and defense equally. Well, on defense, teams aren't going to be running 50 to 60 different calls a game. They usually have a few core coverages that you're going to see multiple times a game, then some variations that come off of that. For example, you have TCU during the 2010s, they really had three main coverages they ran. They had cover blue, which in Madden is essentially palms, where it plays 2 read. Cover 2 robber, which Madden, the best approximation of that is cover 2 invert. And then cover 5, which Madden doesn't have an exact representation of, but the closest thing you'd actually see to it is cover 2 sink. And then they have split field coverages off of that, where you'd have one half of the field would play their cover blue, one half would be playing 2 robber, and things like that. Really, you have 3 coverages. Then you have coverage rule checks based off formation and personnel. Then you're going to have just splitting the field and running both coverages at the same time. One half of the field plays one plays the other. You don't have team playing cover 3 from single high, then moving to cover 2, then going back to cover 3, running cover 2 man, running cover 1 robber from single high, then going back to another 2 high look. You don't have teams running 20 different coverages or even 10 different coverages a game, really. It's usually the same few coverages with slight variations and checks based off what the defense or what the offense is doing and trying to take away those specific things. And when leagues try and implement these play call cooldowns, you are either limited with being able to call the correct defense with the correct front and run fits to defend what the offense is doing. As you can see in this game, I'm facing a lot of I formation and I don't always have the run fits available to defend it. And one thing I always find myself doing in leagues like that is holding on to plays that I really should be calling on first or second down to defend what formation they come out in for third down, because I want to have a chance to get off the field. Well, what usually happens then is on first or second down I give up a huge play and never get to third down. And that just creates a very frustrating experience on defense, where I know what they're going to run or I have a good idea of what they're going to run. I just can't call what I need to do to defend it. Another rule that I frequently see that paints with a broad brush is banning no huddle on offense. And one of the most common reasons I'm given for this is that it makes it harder for the defense to make adjustments with changing zones, QB spies, contains, moving players around. But that's really what the whole point of no huddle is to make it harder for the defense to make adjustments and run exotic coverages. You want to keep them in the same personnel groupings, not allow them to substitute, and keep them in the same basic coverages every time. And something else that goes hand in hand with that is banning quick snapping. Leagues will have rules that require the offenses to allow the defense to get set after a certain amount of time when they get to the line of scrimmage. Well, the onus shouldn't be on the offense to make the defense's life easier. It should be on the defense to figure out what adjustments they can make in that time frame and prioritize what they have to get done. Then another reason I've seen for not allowing no huddle is that apparently occasionally sometimes in running no huddle and audibling between formations or different plays, players can get flipped around and lined up in the incorrect position. So you'll have for example, a receiver at tight end on the line of scrimmage or a receiver at halfback or something like that. Well, that's not a reason to ban no huddling. There are much better ways to target that specific part of it. You don't have to ban no huddle itself. you can target the actual problem rather than painting with a broad brush and eliminating everything else that goes along with it. So for example, you could have rules that require the offense to only be allowed to snap the ball if players are lined up in their correct positions. So if your receiver lines up at tight end when you try and run no huddle and audible, which is still a very infrequent bug, the offense will either have to take a timeout or audible to something else. And that onus will be on the offense to make the correction. As long as they don't snap the ball when players are misaligned, there's no problem. And what it really comes down to is don't cut off the nose despite the face. Have the rules specifically target what they're trying to take away, rather than just eliminating everything that's even remotely in the vicinity of it. And just some other things that I'm going to say as a deal breaker for me when trying to join the CFM is rules that prevent a realistic playstyle. And this is something I saw the other day. It was a league that had the rule saying you should be in base defense a majority of the time and only nickel and dime packages on things like 3rd and long or 4th and long. Well, that's not even remotely how the NFL is, and it's not how college is, it's not how high school is, really. Well, high school you might, depending on what you have available and your personnel. But at the college and the NFL, you don't really see that. At the NFL level, nowadays, usually at least 50% of the time, probably 60% or more now, defense is going to be in nickel defense rather than in their base 4-3 or 3-4 formations. Usually 4-3 and 3-4, you're only in that maybe 25% of the time. And usually in Madden, I'm going personnel match and run, say, 4-3, which is where I run the most for things like 21 personnel, 22 personnel, 2 tight ends, 2 running backs, 12 personnel with 1 back, 2 tight ends. Your heavier sets where you want the linebackers out there to help defend against the run when they have those extra blockers out there with tight ends and multiple running backs. And then things like 11 personnel, 10 personnel, 20 personnel, and such, I'd want to be in nickel sets where I can defend the pass better. Then I'll run dime on things like 3rd and long. So one final thing I want to touch on with the rules before I move on to other things is rules that regulate play calling. So for example, you'll have leagues that have rules where you have to meet a minimum amount of rushing attempts or a minimum amount of passing attempts in a game. And while it's good to have diversity in how much team runs the ball and how much team passes the ball, at least some formation variety, so it's not the same formation the entire time and the same play the entire time. You want a few variations of the concepts, a few formations, and mixing up the run and pass to a reasonable amount. But where you run into problem having these hard quotas of what teams have to meet is you often may not be able to call the plays you should be calling if you're having to meet a quota. So for example, if you're running a traditionalist old school Mike Leach style air raid, probably somewhere north of 90%, roughly 90% of your run plays are probably called up the line of scrimmage by the quarterback. And that's really based off what he sees from the defense with how many defenders are on the box and do we like the front they have. Well, a lot of players in Madden won't adapt. They're going to run the same things the entire time. So you'll face stacked boxes sometimes, even though you're running spread and attacking the perimeter each play. They'll keep stacking 6-7 guys in the box where you can't really run against that. So if you're trying to meet the quota that the league has on how many rushing attempts you have, you're going to be calling plays that you shouldn't be calling. Similarly on defense, I've kind of already touched on this with the play call cooldowns. But if you're trying to run a wide variety of coverages, which teams don't really do, you're going to wind up having to call something that you shouldn't be calling in that situation. And just puts you at a disadvantage and just kind of creates broken plays. So now that I've kind of really touched on everything I wanted to with the rules portion, and this game's getting pretty close to being over with, I really wanted to hit on just a few more points. of what I look for in a league. And one of them is how active is the player base and community in the Discord server? Are people watching the other user games? Are they commenting on them and spectating? Are people talking about sports in general? What's going on with the NFL player trades? What happened in games? And things like that. And, just general good-natured trash talking also. Just things that want to make you stay around in the league and be engaged with it. And kind of the final thing I really wanted to talk about is having good and active commissioners in the league, and that's really something that can make or break it. What you don't want is a league that's run by a petty tyrant who is my way or the highway. I'm going to rule with an iron fist and not take feedback from anyone. You want your commissioner who is somewhat flexible and willing to adapt and take feedback from people. But on the opposite end, you also don't want a league that's completely run by a majority vote wins and determines all the rules. Because eventually what happens is you have two wolves and a sheep on voting what's for dinner. You need a system that provides majority rules and minority rights. You need someone who can act in that Supreme Court role to make sure the minority's rights don't get trampled on. Because that's usually what happens when you have leagues that are completely run by majority votes, is that someone does, or the majority won't like something that's completely reasonable to have in a football game, and it gets removed. You have to have some type of checks and balances in your league. And that's really all I wanted to touch on for this video. Kind of covered all the major points I have of what I look for in leagues and what my deal breakers are. See a really efficient game there from Herbert. 20 of 22, 3 touchdowns, 90% completion. Did have that one pick on a screenplay that wasn't fully blocked all the way. But anyways, put down in the comments what your must-haves are when you're looking for a CFM to join and what your deal breakers are. Curious to see what things you guys look for.